What if the holiest city on earth began not as a place of worship, but as a fortress of defiance? What if the ground beneath the Western Wall, beneath the Dome of the Rock, beneath centuries of prayer and pilgrimage, was once the territory of a people who mocked the very nation that would make it sacred? What if Jerusalem, the city that three of the world's great religions call their spiritual center, was chosen not because it was magnificent, but precisely because it was overlooked? This is not a story that begins with glory. It begins with a problem, a king and a city perched on a rocky hill that nobody else wanted. This is the dramatic, little-known story of how Jerusalem rose from obscurity to become the holy center of the biblical world. To understand why Jerusalem matters, you have to understand the world David inherited. And that world was a world on the edge of collapse. For generations, the 12 tribes of Israel had functioned less like a unified nation and more like a loose collection of clans, bound by ancestry and faith, but deeply divided by geography, pride, and competition. They shared the same God, the same covenant, the same history of slavery in Egypt and wandering in the wilderness. They had the same sacred stories, but when it came to politics, territory, and power, each tribe guarded its own interests with fierce intensity. The first king, Saul, had managed to hold this fragile union together through military prowess and sheer force of personality. He was tall, handsome, anointed by the prophet Samuel, and for a season he seemed like exactly the kind of leader the nation needed. But Saul's reign unraveled from the inside. Disobedience, pride, a deepening darkness that the scriptures describe with haunting detail, a man tormented, isolated, increasingly erratic. The Spirit of God, the text tells us, had departed from him. When Saul fell in battle against the Philistines on the slopes of Mount Gilboa, his armor-bearer refusing to strike him, his own sword turned against himself, the nation was left not merely without a king, but without a center. The tribes fractured almost immediately. The northern tribes rallied around Saul's surviving son, Ishbosheth. The southern tribe of Judah turned to David. For 7.5 years, the two sides fought. It was a civil war in slow motion, a grinding, bitter conflict that claimed lives, deepened rivalries, and left the nation weaker with every passing season. Then Ishbosheth was assassinated in his own bed, and the elders of the northern tribes came to David at Hebron. They acknowledged what many had long known: David was the one God had chosen. The anointing they now gave him was his third, first by Samuel in secret, then by his own tribe of Judah, and now by all 12 tribes together. David was 30 years old. He had been running, hiding, and fighting for the better part of his adult life. Now, at last, he was king of a united Israel. But there was a problem. A serious structural problem that no amount of military victory could solve. His capital was Hebron, a city deep in the territory of his own tribe, Judah. To the northern tribes, moving the seat of government to Hebron was not a neutral act. It was a statement. The south had won, and the north would be governed from southern soil. The old rivalries, barely suppressed, would ignite all over again. David understood this instinctively. He had spent years learning to read people, learning the currents of human ambition and resentment. He knew that a capital in Hebron would not unify Israel. It would quietly divide it, like a fault line running beneath the surface of an otherwise solid foundation. He needed something different. He needed a city that belonged to no tribe at all. In the rugged hill country of Canaan, roughly at the boundary between the tribal territories of Judah and Benjamin, sat a city that had resisted Israelite control for centuries. The biblical text notes with almost casual brutality that when the tribes had first entered the land under Joshua, they had been unable to drive out the Jebusites. Generation after generation, the Jebusites had held their ground. The city sat on a narrow ridge, the Ophel, as archaeologists call it, flanked on three sides by deep valleys. To the west, the Valley of Hinnom. To the east, the Kidron Valley. Only from the north was the approach relatively level, and even there the ridge narrowed and the terrain was unforgiving. The Jebusites had lived inside these natural defenses for so long that they had developed something more dangerous than military strength. They had developed contempt. The biblical account in 2 Samuel chapter 5 records their taunt with a detail so specific it has puzzled and fascinated scholars for centuries. When David moved his forces toward the city, the Jebusites shouted down from their walls that even the blind and the lame could defend Jebus against him. It was an extraordinary insult, the kind that is designed not merely to discourage but to humiliate. Some scholars believe the Jebusites may have been invoking a kind of ritual curse, placing their city under the symbolic protection of the most vulnerable and therefore most spiritually potent members of their society. Others read it more simply as pure mockery. Our walls are so strong, our position so impregnable, that we would not even need healthy soldiers to stop you. Whatever the Jebusites intended, they had misread their opponent. David was not simply a military commander. He was a man who thought sideways. He had spent years as a fugitive in the wilderness, surviving by his wits and by an acute understanding of terrain, timing, and human psychology. He looked at Jebus the way he had once looked at Goliath, not as an obstacle too large to fight, but as a problem waiting for an unexpected solution. The solution, the biblical text suggests, was water. Inside the ridge on which Jebus sat, there was a natural tunnel, a shaft cut through the limestone bedrock that connected the city's interior to the Gihon Spring in the Kidron Valley below. This was the city's lifeline. In a landscape where water sources were precious and sieges were a constant threat, controlling access to water was everything. The Jebusites had engineered a way to reach their water supply without ever leaving the safety of their walls. They believed this gave them an insurmountable advantage. What they had not anticipated was someone coming up from below. The text tells us David called out to his men, asking who would be willing to scale this shaft, this sinner, the Hebrew word that has generated enormous scholarly debate about exactly what kind of structure it describes. David promised that whoever led the assault would be made commander of the entire army. A young commander named Joab, already distinguished in David's service, accepted the challenge. What followed was one of the most audacious military operations in ancient history. In darkness, through water and stone, Joab and a small group of warriors climbed the shaft and emerged inside the city. By the time the Jebusites realized what had happened, the gates were open and David's forces were pouring in. The city fell not to a siege, not to a direct assault on its formidable walls, but to imagination, to the willingness to find the door that no one else thought to look for. David named it the City of David. It would not remain merely a city for long. Military conquest was only the beginning. David understood something that many rulers throughout history have failed to grasp. You can take a city by force, but you cannot make it sacred by decree. Holiness is not commanded, it is invited. For that, David needed the Ark. The Ark of the Covenant was the most sacred object in Israel's possession. A chest of acacia wood overlaid with gold, approximately 4 feet long and 2 feet wide, carried on poles that passed through golden rings on its sides. Its lid, the mercy seat, was adorned with 2 golden cherubim, their wings spread upward and inward, facing each other across the lid. Inside were the stone tablets of the law, the tangible record of the covenant God had made with Israel at Sinai. The Ark was not merely a religious symbol. It was understood to be the footstool of the invisible throne of God, the place where the presence of the Lord descended in a particular and potent way. And for years, the Ark had been sitting in exile. Decades earlier, during a disastrous battle with the Philistines at a place called Aphek, the Israelites had made a catastrophic decision. Desperate to turn the tide of battle, they had brought the Ark from the tabernacle at Shiloh to the front lines. as if it were a weapon or a talisman that could be deployed on command. The gamble failed spectacularly. The Israelites were routed, 30,000 soldiers killed, and the ark itself was captured by the Philistines. What followed, the book of 1 Samuel records with dark humor, was a disaster for the Philistines. Wherever they brought the ark, catastrophe followed. Their god Dagon was found face down before it. Tumors and sickness broke out in their cities. The Philistines, thoroughly unnerved, loaded the ark onto a cart pulled by untrained cows, pointed the cart toward Israelite territory, and essentially let it go home on its own. The cows, without any guidance, walked straight to the Israelite town of Beth Shemesh. But the ark's homecoming was troubled. 70 men of Beth Shemesh were struck down after looking inside it, a stark reminder, the text suggests, that familiarity with sacred things does not confer immunity to their power. The ark was moved again, this time to Kiriath Jearim, to the house of a man named Abinadab, where it remained for 20 years. Largely forgotten. Largely unconsulted. A holy object left on a shelf while the nation stumbled through crisis after crisis. David intended to change that. His plan was to bring the ark to Jerusalem, to unite the political capital and the spiritual center in a single place. The ambition was breathtaking. But the first attempt went terribly wrong. The text in 2 Samuel chapter 6 describes the procession with vivid detail. 30,000 chosen men of Israel accompanied David. They loaded the ark onto a new cart pulled by oxen, a well-intentioned gesture that nonetheless violated the Mosaic law, specifying that the ark was to be carried on poles on the shoulders of the Levites, never transported by animal. As the procession moved joyfully down the road, the oxen stumbled, the ark shifted, and a man named Uzzah reached out instinctively to steady it. He died instantly. The text says David was angry, and then, immediately, afraid. The joy of the procession evaporated into shock and bewilderment. What had just happened? Why had a well-meaning gesture resulted in death? Scholars and theologians have wrestled with this passage for centuries. Some read Uzzah's death as a stark object lesson in the holiness of God, a reminder that the sacred cannot be handled casually, however good our intentions. Others see it as a corrective. The violation was not Uzzah's individual act, but the entire decision to transport the ark on a cart rather than on poles as the law required. The death was not arbitrary. It was a consequence built into the fabric of what holiness means, that the presence of God cannot be approached on human terms alone. David, shaken to his core, stopped the procession. He left the ark at the house of a man named Obed-Edom the Gittite and waited. 3 months passed. And during those 3 months, the house of Obed-Edom was visibly, undeniably blessed. The text is precise. God blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. News of this blessing reached David. Slowly, his fear transformed back into longing. This time, he did it right. The Levites carried the ark on their shoulders, on poles, exactly as the law required. The procession moved through the landscape with a mixture of solemnity and wild, uncontainable joy. Every 6 steps, a sacrifice was made. Musicians played instruments of every kind. The people shouted. And David, the king of Israel, the commander of armies, the man who had killed lions and bears with his bare hands, who had stood before a giant with only a sling, David danced. The text says he danced before the Lord with all his might. He wore a linen ephod, a priestly garment, and he leaped and spun in front of the procession with an abandon that embarrassed his wife and exhilarated the crowd. Michal, daughter of Saul, David's first wife, a woman who had watched her first family destroyed and her life upended by David's rise, watched from a window as the king danced. The text says she despised him in her heart. Later she confronted him, her words dripping with sarcasm. How glorious was the king of Israel today! uncovering himself before the eyes of the servant girls like a common man. Her contempt was layered. It was about dignity, yes, but beneath that, perhaps, it was about grief. She had watched her father's legacy disappear. She could not bring herself to rejoice in what had replaced it. David's response was one of the most theologically significant speeches in the books of Samuel. He told Michal that the celebration was before the Lord, not for her benefit, not for the crowds, not even for his own. It was an act of worship directed upward, not outward. And then he said something that still resonates. Before the Lord who chose me rather than your father, I will celebrate. The anointing was not David's achievement. It was God's choice. And David's dancing was not undignified. It was the most honest possible response to that grace. The ark entered the city of David. They set it in the tent that David had prepared for it. Burnt offerings were made. Peace offerings were made. David blessed the people in the name of the Lord and distributed bread and wine to every man and woman in Israel. For one shining afternoon, the nation ate and drank and celebrated together around the presence of God. Jerusalem was no longer merely a political capital. Something else had entered it. With the ark resting in Jerusalem, David turned his attention to an idea that had been forming in his mind for some time. The king lived in a palace of cedar, beautiful, permanent, fragrant wood imported from Lebanon at great expense. But the Ark of the Covenant, the dwelling place of God's presence, still sat in a tent. The contrast troubled David deeply. He went to the prophet Nathan and shared his desire. He wanted to build a house for God, a permanent temple to replace the portable tabernacle that had served Israel since the wilderness years. Nathan's first response was enthusiastic. Do whatever is in your heart, for the Lord is with you. But that night, God spoke to Nathan. And what God said was not what either of them expected. The divine message, in 2 Samuel chapter 7, is one of the most remarkable passages in the entire Old Testament. A piece of speech so carefully constructed, so deliberately layered, that theologians have called it the theological center of the entire historical narrative. God began by asking a question. Have I ever asked anyone to build me a house? Since the day I brought Israel out of Egypt, I have moved from tent to tent and dwelling to dwelling. Did I ever say to any of the judges, why have you not built me a house of cedar? The implication was clear. God had not been homeless. He had chosen to be mobile. The tent was not a deprivation. It was a deliberate choice. And then came the reversal that takes the breath away. God told David that he would not build God a house, but God would build David a house. And the word house carried an entirely different meaning. Not a building, not cedar and stone, a dynasty. A lineage, a royal family that would endure not for a generation, not for a century, but forever. When David's days were ended, God said, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name. I will be his father, and he will be my son. And I will never take my love away from him. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. The Davidic covenant. Theologians have called it the hinge on which the entire Old Testament swings. Everything before it, the call of Abraham, the exodus from Egypt, the conquest of Canaan, was preparation. Everything after it, the prophets, the Psalms, the hope of restoration, flows from it. The promise was not merely about a dynasty. It was about a future king whose reign would have no end. Centuries later, when the prophets began to speak of a coming Messiah, it was this promise they returned to again and again. When Matthew began his gospel with the words, the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, he was tracing a line back to this moment. This night, when David sat before the Lord and learned that his greatest contribution to the world would not be buildings or battles, but blood. David's response to this promise is one of the most beautiful prayers in Scripture. He went in and sat before the Lord, a phrase remarkable in itself, because in ancient Near Eastern culture you did not sit in the presence of royalty unless invited. Yet here is David, sitting before the God of the universe, and the posture is not prostration, but intimacy. He said, simply, "Who am I, Lord, and what is my family, that you have brought me this far?" He acknowledged that God had spoken not only of the present, but of the distant future. And he asked for nothing. He simply blessed the name of God. In that moment, Jerusalem became something it would carry forever after. Not just the capital of a nation, not just the location of a king's palace, but the city of divine promise, the place where God had spoken the most extraordinary covenant in human history, and where a man had sat in silence and simply received it. The rest of David's life was marked by a paradox that his story alone could produce. He was the greatest king Israel ever had, a military genius, a poet of unparalleled depth, a leader whose personal charisma drew loyalty from the fiercest warriors of his generation. And yet the thing he wanted most was denied to him. The reason the Scriptures give is precise. David had shed much blood and fought many wars. He was a man of war. The temple would be built by a man of peace, not because God condemned what David had done. Many of his wars were explicitly sanctioned, even commanded. But the temple would require a different kind of king for its construction. A king who could bring together the administrative, diplomatic, and artistic resources needed for a project of unprecedented scale. A king like Solomon. David accepted this. And then he spent the rest of his reign making the project possible. The account in 1 Chronicles, the parallel narrative that fills in what 2 Samuel leaves out, gives us a staggering picture of what David gathered. 100,000 talents of gold, 1,000,000 talents of silver, bronze and iron beyond measuring, cedar logs without number from the Phoenician coast, stonemasons, craftsmen, carpenters, organized and ready. The priests and Levites counted, assigned, and organized into rotating divisions that would serve in the temple year-round. Even the blueprints, the layout of the courts, the dimensions of the holy place and the Holy of Holies, the design of the lampstands and the tables, David had received by the Spirit of God and written down for Solomon. He had also written songs. The Psalms are perhaps David's most enduring legacy, and many of them were written specifically for use in the temple that he would never see completed. Psalm 24, the great antiphonal hymn asking who may ascend the hill of the Lord, answered with the declaration that the King of Glory is coming in. Psalm 48, the Song of Zion, describing the city of God as the joy of the whole earth. Psalm 122, the Pilgrim's Song of Ascent, written for the worshippers who would climb toward Jerusalem from every direction, lifting their eyes to the city and praying for its peace. David was writing the soundtrack for a concert he would not attend. There is something profoundly moving about this. A man who poured his life into building something he knew he would never personally enjoy. The temple was not his legacy in the sense of something he could point to and say, "Look what I made." It was his legacy in the deeper sense, something that would outlast him, that would bless generations he would never meet, that would carry his worship forward long after his voice had been silenced. He gathered Israel's leaders together near the end of his life and spoke to them plainly. He told them the full story, his desire to build the temple, God's prohibition, God's promise about Solomon. He charged Solomon publicly, in front of the whole assembly, to carry out the work. And he said something that echoes through every generation of people who long to serve God but find their plans redirected. Consider now. For the Lord has chosen you to build a house for the sanctuary. Be strong and do it. Then, in a gesture of extraordinary generosity, he gave to the temple treasury from his own personal wealth. gold and silver above and beyond what he had already gathered for the public account. The leaders followed his example. They gave willingly and joyfully, and David's prayer over that moment of giving is perhaps the most theologically mature thing he ever said. Everything comes from you, and we have given you only what comes from your hand. We are foreigners and strangers in your sight, as were all our ancestors. Our days on earth are like a shadow, without hope. Lord our God, all this abundance that we have provided for building you a temple, it comes from your hand, and all of it belongs to you. A man who had everything, giving everything back, because he understood that he had never owned any of it in the first place. From a historical and archaeological perspective, the transformation of Jerusalem under David represents one of the most significant urban developments in the ancient Levant, and one of the most debated. The city of David sits on a narrow, elongated ridge south of what is now the old city of Jerusalem. It is a surprisingly small piece of ground for a place of such enormous historical significance, perhaps just 12 acres at its core in David's time. Excavations that have been ongoing since the 19th century and intensifying significantly in recent decades have revealed a complex and layered archaeological record that continues to yield new information. Among the most significant finds is the massive stepped stone structure, a monumental construction of stone terracing that covers the eastern slope of the Ophel Ridge and appears to date to the Iron Age. Many archaeologists believe this represents the foundation support system for a significant building on the summit, possibly connected to what the text calls the Millo, a Hebrew word meaning fill, which David is said to have built and repaired. Whether this structure belonged to the Jebusites and was subsequently used and expanded by David, or whether it was primarily a product of Davidic construction, remains debated, but its sheer scale speaks to serious administrative and logistical ambition. The Gihon Spring remains a living presence beneath the modern city, still flowing after 3,000 years, still the primary ancient water source for the ridge. Warren's Shaft, discovered by the British explorer Charles Warren in 1867, was for many decades assumed to be the very water shaft through which Joab climbed to take the city. More recent analysis has suggested the story may be more complicated. The shaft may not have been accessible from outside the city walls in the way the older interpretation assumed. Some scholars now read the military action differently, focusing on the tunnel system itself rather than a single vertical shaft. The debate continues, but what is indisputable is that the Gihon was the lifeblood of ancient Jerusalem, and whoever controlled it controlled the city. The period of David's rule, roughly 1000 to 970 BC in the conventional chronology, falls in what archaeologists call the Iron Age Ea. This period has been the subject of intense academic controversy, particularly regarding the question of whether a unified Israelite monarchy of the scale described in the biblical text actually existed at this time. Some scholars, often called minimalists, have argued that the Jerusalem of David's day was too small to be the capital of a significant kingdom, that the archaeological evidence for monumental building from this period is thin, and that the biblical narrative reflects a later, idealized reconstruction. Other scholars, particularly those who have worked closely with the City of David excavations, point to increasingly significant finds: the large stone structure, evidence of administrative activity, pottery assemblages consistent with the Iron Age Aya date, and the general pattern of settlement consistent with a growing urban center. The discovery of what excavator Eilat Mazar proposed as a large public building dating to the 10th century BC, which she associated with David's palace, generated enormous controversy and enthusiasm in equal measure. The debate about that specific identification continues, but the broader point stands. The site of ancient Jerusalem shows clear evidence of significant occupation and development in exactly the period the biblical text describes. What we can say with confidence is this: Jerusalem was a real place. The Gihon Spring is a real water source. The ridge on which the city of David sits is a real piece of geography. And the Iron Age Ea period was a time of significant political development across the Levant. The biblical narrative of David's capture and development of the city is geographically coherent, strategically plausible, and consistent with what we know of the broader political landscape of ancient Canaan in this period. The stones do not prove every detail of the story, but they do not contradict it either, and they whisper to those willing to listen that something remarkable happened on this small, rocky hill at the edge of the Judean wilderness. The transformation of Jerusalem under David was not merely political or architectural. It was spiritual in the most fundamental sense, and it was that spiritual dimension that would give the city its enduring significance across millennia. By the end of David's reign, Jebus, the fortress that had taunted Israel for centuries, had become Zion, the city of the great king, the place where heaven and earth touched in a way that could not be explained purely in terms of geography or politics. The Psalms that David wrote returned to Jerusalem again and again, not as a political center, but as the locus of divine presence. Psalm 46, God is in the midst of her, she shall not be moved. Psalm 48, great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised in the city of our God. Psalm 76, his abode has been established in Salem, his dwelling place in Zion. The city had become theology. More than a capital, it was a confession, a declaration that the God of Israel had chosen to dwell with his people in a specific, physical, locatable place. Not merely in heaven, not merely in the human heart, but here, on this hill, between these valleys, at the headwaters of this spring. This was a radical theological claim. In the ancient world, deities were generally associated with natural features, mountains, rivers, storms, or with the cult objects housed in their temples. What was unusual about Israel's God was the combination, not confined to a single location, and yet choosing to be particularly present in one. The ark could move, had traveled through the wilderness for 40 years. But now it rested in Jerusalem, and in resting there, it declared that this city was different from all other cities. When the prophets later spoke of the nations streaming to Jerusalem, of swords being beaten into plowshares, of all peoples coming to the mountain of the Lord to learn his ways, they were building on the foundation that David had laid. When exiles in Babylon sat by the rivers and wept, asking how they could sing the Lord's song in a foreign land, it was Jerusalem they were remembering. When they prayed facing that direction 3 times a day, it was toward this city. When pilgrims from every corner of the land began the great ascents for the 3 annual festivals, Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles, Jerusalem was the destination, and the songs they sang on the road were the psalms of ascent that David and his successors had written for exactly this journey. And then, centuries later, a man from Nazareth in the north of the country set his face toward Jerusalem. He entered on a donkey while the crowds waved palm branches. He overturned tables in the temple courts. He sat in the same city where David had danced, where Solomon had prayed, where the prophets had thundered and wept. And in Jerusalem he was crucified, buried, and, his followers proclaimed, raised from the dead. The city that David had claimed for God became the city where, Christians believe, God himself came in human form to complete the covenant that David had trusted. The Davidic promise, a son of David on an eternal throne, found its ultimate fulfillment not in a palace, but on a cross, and then in an empty tomb outside the city walls. Whether you read that as history or as theology or as both, the astonishing chain of events begins with a warrior king staring up at a Jebusite fortress and deciding that this was the place. This hill, these walls, this spring. Here, David's final years were shadowed by personal tragedy on a scale that would have destroyed a lesser man. His son Amnon violated his daughter Tamar. His beloved son Absalom murdered Amnon and then, years later, led a rebellion that forced David to flee Jerusalem on foot, barefoot, weeping as he crossed the Kidron Valley. The sight of the king, aged, grief-stricken, surrounded by a shrinking band of loyal soldiers, descending the Mount of Olives, must have seemed like the end of everything. A man passing a milestone on the road threw stones at him and cursed him. David's companions wanted to cut the man down. David stopped them. If his own son wanted him dead, he said, perhaps the Lord had sent this man to curse him. Who was he to interfere? It is in moments like this, not in his triumphs, that David's character reveals itself most fully. The man who could write with such tenderness about the Lord as his shepherd, who could dance before the ark with uninhibited joy, who could pray with such transparent honesty about his own failures and God's faithfulness, was also a man capable of profound resilience in the face of catastrophic personal loss. He did not become bitter. He did not abandon his faith. He kept walking. Absalom's rebellion was eventually crushed, though Absalom himself was killed, against David's explicit orders, by Joab, and David's grief over his son became one of the most raw expressions of parental love in ancient literature. "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom. Would God I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." And then there was Bathsheba. The moral failure that the text does not hide, does not minimize, does not excuse. David had seen her bathing from the rooftop of his palace and had sent for her. When she became pregnant, he had tried to cover it up, and when that failed, he had arranged the death of her husband Uriah, one of his own finest soldiers, by placing him in the front of a battle and ordering the other troops to fall back. It was murder by proxy, and the prophet Nathan confronted David with it directly. "You are the man." David's response was not justification or deflection. It was confession. Psalm 51, "Create in me a clean heart, O God," is believed to be the psalm David wrote after Nathan's confrontation. It is perhaps the most honest piece of devotional writing ever produced, a man acknowledging, without reservation, that he had sinned against God above all others, asking not for a lighter sentence, but for a renewed spirit, a steadfast heart, the restoration of the joy of salvation. The child born to Bathsheba died as Nathan had foretold. David fasted and prayed while the child lived. When the child died, he rose, washed, ate, and went to the house of God to worship. His servants were bewildered. He explained, "While the child was alive, I fasted because I thought the Lord might be gracious to me and let him live. But now that he is dead, why should I fast? I cannot bring him back. I will go to him, but he will not return to me." Theology wrung from grief, faith not despite suffering but through it, shaped by it, carrying the marks of it. From Bathsheba, eventually, came Solomon, whose name means peace, given to him by God through the prophet Nathan in a second naming, Jedediah, beloved of the Lord. And Solomon would be the one who built the temple. The continuity is staggering. The man who danced, who sinned, who grieved, who confessed, who gathered materials he would never use, who wrote songs for services he would never lead, his life became the preparation for one of the most magnificent structures the ancient world had ever seen. His failures did not disqualify his legacy. His repentance did not erase the consequences. But through it all, the purpose of God moved forward. Today, 3,000 years after David climbed up to the Jebusite fortress and made it his own, Jerusalem remains the most contested piece of real estate on the planet. 3 religions claim it. Multiple nations have fought over it. Pilgrims in their millions still make the journey to stand before its ancient stones, to press their prayers into the gaps between them, to stand on the ridge above the Kidron Valley and feel the weight of all that has happened here. Walk the narrow alleys of the old city, and you walk through 25 centuries of accumulated human meaning. Every stone carries a memory. Every corner echoes with something. A prayer, a battle, a procession, a lament. The walls that Suleiman the Magnificent built in the 16th century stand on foundations laid by Herod 2,000 years ago, which themselves stand on fills that reach down to the Iron Age, to the time of David himself. Stand at the edge of the City of David archaeological site and look north toward the Temple Mount. And you are standing roughly where the Ark of the Covenant rested in its tent, while David dreamed of building it a permanent home. Look east and you see the Kidron Valley where the procession wound upward with music and dancing. Look south and you see the ridge narrowing toward the ancient agricultural terraces, the land that fed the city for millennia. The Gihon Spring still flows. You can stand in the tunnel that Hezekiah's engineers cut through the bedrock 700 years after David's time, knee-deep in water in the dark, and feel the extraordinary continuity of this place. Water that has been flowing here since before recorded history. Water that David's city depended on. Water that is still flowing today. There is something in Jerusalem that refuses to be merely historical. It pulls. It insists. Even secular visitors who arrive expecting art and archaeology find themselves caught off guard by something they cannot quite name. A gravity, a weight of accumulated meaning that presses against you in a way that the Louvre or the Acropolis simply does not. The theological meaning of that weight is, of course, contested. Jews understand Jerusalem as the site of the divine promise to David, the location of the two temples, the center toward which prayer has been directed for 3,000 years, the city whose return is embedded in the deepest liturgical memory of the people. Christians see it as the city where the gospel was announced, where the Messiah died and rose, where the church began on a day of fire and wind and the sound of many languages. Muslims revere it as the site from which the Prophet ascended in the night journey, and as the location of one of the holiest mosques in Islam. All three traditions trace something essential in their identity back to this hill, to this spring, to these stones. And it all began with a king who needed a neutral capital, a city perched on a ridge that no tribe could claim as its own, and a God who had decided that this was where he wanted to be. The story of Jerusalem is not finished. The city that David chose is still at the center of the world's attention, still contested, still prayed over, still longed for. The prophets spoke of a Jerusalem to come that would surpass even Solomon's in glory. John, on the island of Patmos, saw a vision of a new Jerusalem descending from heaven like a bride adorned for her husband. Whether you read that as literal prophecy or as poetry about the ultimate destination of human history, the image is rooted in what David began, the conviction that God chooses a place to dwell with his people, and that dwelling is the deepest longing of the human heart. Jerusalem's rise from obscurity reminds us of a pattern that runs through the entire biblical narrative. God does not choose the magnificent and make it holy. He chooses the small, the overlooked, the unexpected, the shepherd boy in the field, the barren woman who would become the mother of nations, the stable in the back streets of a village, the rocky hill that every conquering army had bypassed for centuries, and makes it the location of something. The world cannot stop talking about 3,000 years later. What he did with Jebus, he did with David. What he did with David, he offers to every ordinary life that opens itself to his presence. The city that was mocked became the city that is prayed toward. The shepherd who was forgotten in the fields while his brothers stood before the prophet became the king after God's own heart. The stones of Jerusalem still whisper the story of a king who danced, a nation that found its center, and a God who delights in choosing the unlikely and making it holy. If this journey into the ancient world of King David and the founding of Jerusalem stirred something in your spirit, if these stones, this spring, this story, spoke to something deep in you, we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell us which part of David's story moved you most. Was it the audacity of the military conquest? The unbridled joy of the dance, the weight of the divine promise spoken into the silence of a single night? The confession of a broken man who refused to stop worshiping? Take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Biblical Worlds. Your support makes it possible for us to continue bringing these cinematic biblical documentaries to life, going deeper into the texts, walking the actual terrain, and telling these ancient stories in ways that make them breathe again. And until next time, may the God who chose Zion also choose to dwell richly, deeply, and permanently in your life.